dots on the forehead, certainly you wouldn't deny them jobs because of that. And those are aspects of their indigenous culture, indigenous forms of spirituality. But when it comes to us, because that part of us has been suppressed for so long, when we try to reach back and say, this is who we are prior to, being in America 400 or 500 years ago, this is, how we styled our hair. And you don't have to believe me. I mean, you can look at statues with people with braids and locks and afros that go back not only centuries, but literally thousands of years ago. So before we ever were over here as slaves, we were styling our hair this way. So, it's just us that when we express ourselves in a way that's consistent with our, indigenous ways, that it's a problem. So again, we need to know the history and why there is this opposition. So I wanted to speak to that. So I just wanted to say that's one form of a lack of freedom, freedom of expression. You should have that, and I think all human beings, all ethnic groups should have that right. So I want to proceed. Oh yeah, also let me add this too. If you want to know about the Rastafarian
culture.
Absolutely. That's another reason I want to speak to that. Some people are Rastas. You got Rasta friends?
Yeah.
Okay. And so have they ever sat down and spoken with you as far as, why they style their hair a certain way and why they do some of the things they do?
They haven't gone into detail. It hasn't come up, but I do understand. I do understand why. I know the rule. I know what has to be done.
Right.
I know, and I understand I know why it has to be done. Yeah. I understand the process that happens there.
There's a wonderful book, and I'm going to speak about some of these things myself, but it's a wonderful book called The Rastafarians, and it's by Leonard E. Barrett Sr. And it's very well written, very well researched, and it talks about the Rastafarian culture and spirituality. But what I wanted to speak to, going back to the locks, a lot of people are Rastas, and they wear their hair that way because that's part of their spiritual system, their culture. In addition to the fact that a lot of them don't drink alcohol, they don't eat pork, or a lot of them pork, or even red meat. And so again, I spoke earlier about people of the Jewish faith or of other faiths being allowed to express themselves freely, and it's not a problem. We have to start being a little more open-minded and understanding that oftentimes when we see people with locks, African garb is just an expression of their spiritual systems or their cultural expressions, and not to call them extreme, like they're going to blow up some buildings or something. Just because a black person is comfortable with who they are and expressing themselves, is no need for anyone to get nervous. And we need to start moving in that direction and evolving as a nation in terms of being more open-minded and understanding to that. So let's move on.
Okay.
I want to talk about another incident, and this occurred some time ago. But this is another example, in my opinion, where there's been a denial of freedom, denied opportunities. And it's a situation, and it was a place in Oklahoma in the early 20th century. And I spoke to this in my song, and it's called Black Wall Street. And it's also referred to as Little Africa. Did you want to kind of speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I was familiar with it before I did some more research. But the details are mind-boggling and amazing. There were 600 businesses there, and 21 years from the early 1900s until 1921, this community existed called Greenwood, and these black people had multiple churches, multiple businesses, hospitals, libraries, planes, a bus system, a transit system, and one night it was decided that this community had to go. There were white peoples on the outskirts of the community that weren't as affluent, that that were having a harder time. And Afi, I know, will give you some more information, but just to touch on it, it was bombed just one night, air bombed. And how it's described, how the historians describe it as a Holocaust. And when you use the word Holocaust, it's a very strong word. And immediately I realized that my education had taught me to associate the word Holocaust with the Jewish experience. And to learn what happened, I mean, 3,000 black people were murdered that night, basically massacred, bombed, children, women, men, all in one night, bodies dumped in mass graves. There's a parking lot over one grave right now. And that's consistent across the country with black burial grounds. And so you have this thing here that the video on YouTube had 1,000 hits. I mean, it's just amazing that so many people don't know about it.
Right. And I didn't even know. You said 1,000 hits?
1,035.
Now, that's sad because the video I saw just today, I didn't have to work today, and the video I was looking at today, I think it's called The Click, and it has Jay-Z.
That new song,
yeah. Jay-Z and what's his name, Kanye, and Big Sean. Has like 9 million hits, 9 million. And this is one of the biggest tragedies in the history of mankind. In one evening, so much damage could have been done, and we weren't taught about it in high school. You're going to be hard pressed to find it in your encyclopedia. I can't remember. It was some time ago when I found out about it, but I was beyond college when I found out about it. And the point I wanted to make was two points. One of the things I wanted to make, again, this is a prime example of freedom denied. I mean, again, let's speak to the numbers. Kacie touched on it, but it says the night's carnage left some 3,000 African Americans dead, over 600 successful businesses lost. Amongst these were 21 churches, 21 restaurants, 30 grocery stores, and 2 movie theaters, plus a hospital, a bank, a post office, libraries, schools, law offices, a half dozen private airplanes, and even a bus system. Kacie spoke on most of those things. As could be expected, the impetus behind it all was the infamous KKK, working in consort with ranking city officials and many other sympathizers. So this has just been swept under the rug. And as she said, this has happened time and time again throughout history. If you know anything, and I spoke on this on my radio show, if you know anything about Reconstruction, the period which is roughly considered between 1865 and 1877, where black folks were supposed to be free, and we were really doing great things economically. We were starting businesses, we were prosperous, we were moving into the political arena even way back then. And in response to that, the KKK came into existence, started burning down homes, burning down businesses, lynching, murdering, castrating black men. So again, these are indications, these are real life examples of freedom denied. And so, it's funny because so often you've heard it, I've heard it, you've heard it yourselves. They tell us black folks need to lift yourselves up, pick yourselves up by the bootstraps. And no one wants to acknowledge, and maybe no one knows, not as many people know as they should, I guess I should say, that so many times, every time we make a move towards progress, there have been conscious efforts to check that progress. And subsequent to that, this information doesn't make it to the news, it doesn't make it to the history books. So it's this type of human crime that's created. They try not to document it, and then they try to make it look like, something's wrong with us intellectually. We don't have the intellectual resources to progress. We're lazy. We don't have the discipline, and all these things. So, that whole thinking that, when you said, black folks need to pick themselves up by the bootstraps, I just like to say to that, our bootstraps have been grabbed and discarded a long time ago. So, we need to know our history. And these are the types of things we need to be studying, as opposed to hitting the YouTube 9 million times to listen to songs like that. We need to hit that site 9 million times and read up on Black Wall Street It's a lot of information. You know, you can just go on the internet, you can YouTube it, you can Google it, you can buy books. It's out there. So let's proceed.
Okay.
I think I'm going to read this. This is also another example of denied freedoms. And this was an article from the Times-Dispatch, our local paper. Boom, there it is, from December 2001. I'm going to try not to read the whole article because that can be kind of boring, but bear with me. It says, as a little girl, Doria D. Johnson often asked about the man in the portrait hanging in an aunt's living room, her great-great-grandfather. It's too painful, her elderly relatives would say, and then they would look away. A few years ago, Johnson, now 40, went to look for answers in the rural town of Abbeville, South Carolina. She learned that in his day, the man in the portrait, Anthony P. Crawford, was one of the most prosperous farmers in Abbeville County. That is until October 21st, 1916, the day the 51-year-old farmer hauled a wagon load of cotton to town. Crawford seems to have been the type of Negro who was most offensive to certain elements of the white people, Mrs. J.B. Holman would say a few days later in a letter published by the Abbeville Press and Banner. He was getting rich for a Negro, and he was insolent along with it. Crawford's prosperity had made him a target. Racial violence in America is a familiar story, but the importance of land as a motive for lynchings and white mob attacks on blacks has been widely overlooked. Let me stop right there momentarily. Because again, historically, we've been told that black men were lynched because they were in relations with white women or they had done something to white women. Again, we have a couple of problems here. First of all, the first problem is denial of rights. This man's land was ultimately taken, and I'm going to read some more of the article in a second. And secondly, even worse than that was the lie that was told to justify the treatment of this man and others like him. So we need to speak to these things. And let's continue. It says, racial violence in America is a familiar story, but again, the importance of land as a motive for lynchings and white mob attacks on blacks has been widely overlooked, and the resulting land losses suffered by black families such as the Crawfords has largely gone unreported. Listen to this. The Associated Press documented 57 land takings in just an 18-month investigation of black land loss in America. It says, for many decades, successful blacks lived with a gnawing fear that white neighbors could at any time do something violent and take everything from them, said Loren, oh boy, this is good, Swiniger, a University of North Carolina expert of land ownership by blacks. Let me turn a few pages and I'll continue. And like I said, I won't belabor this point, I won't read too long, but I think it's important that we touch on this. Let's see. I'm going to skip down a little bit. Okay, it says, while waiting his turn at the gin that day, that fall day in 1916, Crawford entered the mercantile store of W.D. Barksdale. Contemporary newspaper accounts in the papers of then Governor Richard Manning detail what followed. Barksdale offered Crawford 85 cents a pound for his cotton seed. Crawford replied that he had a better offer. Barksdale called him a liar. Crawford called the storekeeper a cheat. 3 clerks grabbed axe handles and Crawford backed into the street, where the sheriff appeared and arrested Crawford for cursing a white man. He was released on bail. Crawford was cornered by about 50 whites who beat him and killed him. The sheriff beat him and knifed him. The sheriff carried him back to the jail. A few hours later, a deputy gave the mob the keys to Crawford's jail cell. At sundown, they hanged him from a solitary southern pine. No one was ever tried for the killing. In the aftermath, hundreds of blacks, including some of the Crawfords, fled Abbeville. Now listen to this. It said 2 whites were appointed executors of Crawford's